One, you're a bucket. You're a bucket because you schedule time and you want to be with your girl all day. I want to be with my girl, my little pierogi. What's up, fam? It's your boy Demuir here, purveyor of all sounds underground. Thank you for joining my YouTube channel today, where I'll be discussing almost like a part 2 of my mono versus stereo video, and I'm gonna call it part 2 under the hood, and just show you more explicitly and practically what I meant in my previous video and some of the supporting reasons as per the notes on my screen cap. But before I jump into things, what I need from you is that SLC. Hit subscribe, like, comment, and more importantly, hit the notifications bell to stay in touch with the new videos that we have up and coming. I think I said this before, and it seems to be fluctuating anywhere between 43 and as high as 50% of people who are watching these videos are unsubscribed. So what go on with that, man? Hit subscribe and stay in touch, fam. But anyway, we shall continue. All right, so let's just jump into things. You can see I have my notes here, and hopefully, Juan, you put me in the bottom right of the screen versus the top. Hope you can do that because we need all the space here. But regardless, why don't we just jump into talking about the things that I was looking at explicitly in my first video about mono versus stereo. So my first point here, just right off the bat as I zoom in, it's all about the monitoring situation. Those who tend to mix in mono tend to have better sounding records. A lot of guys, I've had this conversation with numerous people. A great artist example is Sébastien Léger from France. And I had the pleasure of meeting him in Amsterdam at an ADE event just a couple of years ago, actually. I think it was my own party. But anyway, I don't want to digress. But Sébastien Léger, I remember seeing, I think it was a computer music masterclass he was showing, and he was mixing down on the shittiest tiny PC speakers. If you remember those from back in the day, I'll try and get a picture and we can post it up. But, you know, those speakers weren't exactly, how should I say, sophisticated in terms of capturing things in the frequency spectrum. But what it allowed Sébastien to do, and at the time he was making a lot of French touch bass house music, was to just hear things clearly. Like, the thought was, hey, if I can hear things clearly on these crappy speakers, I know my records are good. And a fairly good analogy at that. You know, you listen to some of the records in the 70s from great mixing and mastering engineers like Bruce Swedian, who did a lot of the Michael Jackson, Rufus, and Quincy Jones projects back in the day. His records are timeless, and they sound that way because I remember seeing an interview with him, and he talks about just mixing on the NS10s and getting the best possible sound out of those, and those tiny little speakers. But man, you can rock a Michael Jackson off the wall record at any party today, any club or festival today, and it still sounds just as great as it was back in the day. So again, my video was all about the monitoring situation, and I want to just show you a closer dive here on my master chain. This is what I was talking about. In my templates, I now have this gain utility here that comes in Logic on my master. It's right at the top before I shave 30 hertz out here, but it's right at the top of the signal, and it's in mono. I convert the signal in mono, so everything that's hitting this bus is allowing me to make the best mixing decisions. So I'm gonna throw on my headphones here just to show you what I'm talking about, and hopefully you're doing the same. You're listening to this on high quality monitors or headphones, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. All right, so this is one of the tracks that I have up in my Choose One series, where I tell people subscribe to my Patreon every month, you know, out of all of these tracks, choose one and I'll make it available for free. So this one is in there, and it's kind of getting some play. It's between this one and the second track, I believe, that are in the top. So check it out. I'll let you listen to this. Pretty dope sample, right? Let's scroll right across. Now, this sample is in stereo, but hitting the master bus in mono. Listen to it if I have the mono conversion off. You can hear more width in it, and it just sounds, I guess, fuller in a sense, right? So let's do this again. Back to mono. Now it's filtered down. I'm going to move it to where the sample's more open. So it's mono, stereo now. I'm going to loop that part again. Mono now. Move back to stereo. It's funky, right? And this is the whole point here. So imagine I have the sample in stereo hitting my master bus without the mono conversion, and the mixing decision I decided to make at that time, let's go to my main loop, was, oh, let me take a little bit out of the mid range, because it actually, when it was in stereo, when I was originally mixing this, it, you know, it sounded like it was distorting and there's too much mid range. But lo and behold, I upgrade to my new Focal Alpha 80 monitors. I have the discussion with Carrie about mono versus stereo, and I'm like, you know what? I don't think I have this down pat yet in my monitoring situation. So let's look at the type of mixing decisions I will now make when I convert this or have it fully in mono. And I can guarantee the mid-range isn't going to sound as rich as you heard here. So here it is again. This is in mono. Now I'm going to play it in stereo now. So you hear a lot more on the sides, and this stuff is happening. So, you know, I'm making music for the club, so I can't leave it this way, right? Because I know that's not what's going to translate in the club. So let's put it in mono here. Now I'm listening to this and I'm saying, geez, you know what? It's actually a little flatter in the mid-range when it's in mono, because I have all of that stereo stuff removed. So now I'm going to make a different mixing decision. I'm going to boost the mid a little bit. That's about right to me right there. Now, here's the other thing you got to keep in mind. Now that I've done that, the right thing to do here is to make sure there's little deviation. I could technically leave this in stereo if I wanted to, but I'm not. I left it in stereo just to show the example of what typically happens to a lot of us in production when you just drag a stereo sample in and then you're mixing from the go and you have no monitoring of what it's doing in mono versus stereo. So I can guarantee now we'll have little to no deviation, but let's listen. Still sounds a bit fuller, but I'll tell you why it sounds like that. It's because of this guy. And it's the Chorus Juno 6. I love this modulation tool, but the biggest reason why I love it, it allows for a bit of width to happen while I could say, give me that thing in mono. I want the mono signal in. I do not want it lost. So when I A/B this thing, switch Juno on, and this is now the master with mono on, and it sounds pretty rich to me. But it wouldn't sound that way if I left my previous mixing decision intact, which was have that low, because it now sounds flat. But previously it sounded okay when I had this area lower in the sample because it was in stereo. And of course with stereo, it's all on the sides, it's sounding fuller and rich, and I'm like, okay, that's cool. But imagine how pissed off I would be, and how pissed off you would be, if you made this mixing decision because that's what you heard when you were monitoring things in stereo, and then when you get to the club, it's actually a little flat. So now I can go back and say this is the right mixing decision. Leave the low mids about. And it's all in mono. Mono here on the main sample, mono in on the chorus effect, and mono at the master level. So now I've moved it to stereo here, but you're only hearing that because it's coming from this plugin. So watch, I'm going to shut the plugin off. This is back to mono, back to stereo, and the plugin is off. Now I'm going to do it with mono and turn the plugin on. So this is mono now. The plugin's on. Very subtle difference, quite impactful in a mono signal. However, because people are listening to things on earbuds, and naturally that'll be in stereo, they're going to hear it this way. So it's in stereo. I'm loving this. It sounds great. I'm going to switch it to mono so I can get a sense of what this is going to sound like in the club now. Sounds a little flatter. It's not as exciting with it being in stereo, but I'll tell you what, it sounds dope to me, and I feel very comfortable when this goes to the club because I didn't make this mixing decision. See what I'm saying? So I'm going to pause there and encourage that you look at this first point a few times, because it might be a little confusing with the A-B that I was doing there, but to summarize, it's really this way. When I had the main sample in stereo hitting the master bus in stereo and not checking it in mono, it caused me, or it influenced me, to make a mixing decision that was wrong, because I'm making music for the clubs, which was this. I had it, let's go back, I had the low mids minus 2.5 dB lower. And I did that because I was listening to stuff in stereo and it just sounded dope. With the chorus effect on and mono in signal going on, I was like, man, this sounds good. But once I hit this mono conversion on, the shit sounded flat to me, and I knew I needed to move this more like around here, you know, with a 1.5 to 1.7 dB boost. This is the whole point of this. Point number one, I can't stress how important this is, because when you hear it in mono, it will influence very different mixing decisions. And if we go back to the Sebastian Leger example, you know, he was mixing on those shitty speakers because they forced him to make the best possible mixing decisions for the music that he was making, which was for the club, to ensure that it sounded great. So I spent a bit of time there intentionally, but this is the main reason why I, you know, do the things I do when it comes to mono versus stereo. It's the same shit that Kerry Chandler does. It's the same stuff that Patrick Adams does, as I was mentioning in the first part of this video. Now, let's move into some of the other practical points here, and point number two, which is most of my channels are in mono. I had this question come up. So when we look across the board here, I have like 20 audio channels in this particular template. You'll see that most of them are indeed in mono. That's what the single circle means here in Logic. It might look a little different in your DAW, but that's what the single circle means. And if I wanted to go stereo, I just hit it and I get the double rings going. So most of my channels are indeed in mono, and that includes the buses as well. They're in mono too. Let's jump into the next point of what do I mean by leave a bit in stereo. So I touched a little bit on this already in terms of the sound, but this plugin here or any other modulation plugin like a chorus or phaser or flanger or whatever, those are the things that help give you a little bit of width in your samples. And I learned this from other top producers back in the 90s, where they would have these little effect units on, but it wouldn't be like a heavy influence in the mix, like 100% wet. You know, it would be more like, not even 50%. It would be like 40% of the signal that is wet, sometimes even lower. But it was there just to create enough depth on that particular instrument. And this is a perfect modern day version, Arturia's Chorus Juno 6. It's a perfect modern version of this because it allows you to throw in the mono signal. So leave a bit of that. The other things I would leave a little bit of stereo action is, I'm trying to see if I got it here. This is a conga, yeah. So this loop here is probably a conga loop. I'm gonna shut off the main sample. So conga loops I'll typically leave in stereo because it gives me that width I'm looking for, and it sounds dope. And let's check here. I still have it in mono, so let's listen to it with mono off. It's a little bit of difference. This is mono on, stereo. Very little difference in that one, but it's really cool to have instruments like that in the mix. And the other thing that helps me decide, well, what elements should I leave in stereo if it's predominantly going to be a mono mix and I'm trying to translate it for the club, well, I just look to see what the instrument is doing. So let's zoom in on a congas here. It's in stereo. There's little deviation between the left and right channels, and it all just comes back to how the recording was mic'd. Like back in the day, it wasn't unusual to have an extreme right pan on a conga set, because the engineer or the producer of the record wanted you to feel like you're in the studio, and every time the percussionist went to the right, it was there. And they had that mic almost deadpan fully to the right. Other situations back in the day, they split the channels up to get more tracks to record on. So they got a certain amount of tracks on the left channel, they got a certain amount of tracks on the right channel, or it would actually be reverse for you, left, right. But you get the drift. When you listen to older records, that's how they recorded. So here, this is I think I got this off a disco loop because I can hear like a bass line, a bass riff underneath it, but point stands, right? It's pretty close to the center because the deviation I was seeing in the level meter wasn't much, and I was okay with that, so I left it in stereo. The other stereo element I would do is a shaker. I don't know what this is. Oh, it's the synth. So perfect example. This is a synth Matrix Brute that I played. So I left that in stereo because it's a synth. It has a lot of layers and some stereo components. But again, not a lot of deviation between the channels of left and right. So that was cool. So leave a little bit in stereo. And the funny thing about this technique is every time I do master classes, it's probably one of the first questions I get. People are like, man, if you're leaving so much in mono, like I have here, and actually I'll point out another point shortly, how do you get depth and width in your mixes? And, those are some of the little things I do to add width to the mix. The mastering engineer might add a little exciter to it. And I don't get involved at that point. I just work with mastering engineers who get my sound and understand what I'm looking to achieve. And they just make it happen. But the other thing is definitely in effects. So these are my chorus. Sorry. This is my tape delay and my reverb buses here. I leave those in stereo. This is another reverb bus here. These are all in stereo, as you can see. I'll zoom in. Stereo with a little EQ on the effect. And kicks and snare bus. Back in the day when I used to do that. These are all mono. And this bus was a pre-music bus that I had. I rarely use this anymore. That I obviously would leave in stereo. So really, a few components, leave it in stereo, it's fine. The next point number 4, is the facts are I still bounce in stereo. So I think I gave, unfortunately, some people an impression when I was talking about making sure your whole signal path is mono. I think some people are like, hey, does that mean he's bouncing in mono too? And the simple answer there is no. All I do is when I'm ready to bounce, I shut off the conversion here of mono, because again, it's all about the monitoring situation, and that's why I spent so much time on point 1 talking about this. So when I'm ready to bounce this out, this is off. And then along with SonarWorks 2, I shut it off. And this leads me to my last point, and I sort of already touched on it. But a few of you guys were saying in the comments, hey, why don't you, they just use SonarWorks to flip the signal on and off. This is a mono button on or off in SonarWorks. And they also do it on the channel too. And to me, that's all good. It's whatever is in your workflow. This just works well for me. And it just makes the most sense for me, which is anything while I'm mixing down, sketching, or song arranging, or whatever, I always need to know where the shit is in the frequency spectrum. I need to know how that shit sounds in mono. And sorry for my profanity, but I'm quite passionate about this because it was a game changer for me when I finally got this. And recently too, having this conversation with Carrie about mono versus stereo and what he does. You think I'm being extreme? Kerry Chandler is on a whole other level. He will have music playing and you go into a lounge and there's 8 speakers there and he's flipping it mono stereo. So like it is a whole other thing, but I can assure you, if you get this down pat of comparing the signals on a regular basis, you will be good. So if you want to do this at a channel level for each one, go ahead, that's cool. I'm just telling you, it works for me to know that anything that's hitting my master bus, I get to hear it in summation in a mono signal format, and it tells me what I can expect coming out the other end, and then I just bounce it in stereo. And my last point on this one, when we're talking about comparing the signals, there really shouldn't be this drastic change between stereo and mono, for me at least. Like that, I want to have a sense of, ooh, this sounds fat and knocking at the mono level. So when I bounce it out in stereo, there might be a little bit of glitter on the sides, but it's not so much that it causes me to say, geez, how come I didn't mix that main sample better, as I just showed you in a practical sense. All right, so there you have it. That is the follow-up to mono versus stereo, part 2, under the hood, getting down and dirty, deep and practical And hopefully you found this as comprehensive as well in terms of understanding the thought process between, you know, the importance of mixing down in mono and monitoring mono versus stereo as you're going along in the process. Let me know your thoughts on this. I'd love to hear it and see it. I usually join the conversation within 48 hours of posting these videos, so I'd love to see what you thought. Much love and respect to you. Peace.